My name is Vir Sanghvi, and I'm hoping that Shashi and I will do at least as good a job as Shekhar would have, but we'll do our best.
Shashi, let me thank you, Vir, for bailing us out by joining this conversation. Thank you again.
Shashi, we're going to talk about the book, so I want to start with what many people in the hall probably would consider the key question, and yet it's not a question we ask often enough. You were brought up in an environment where though we were a Hindu majority country, we were a secular country. There was no sense in which it was a Hindu country and non-Hindus were our guests. There is an increasing amount of sentiment against that feeling. A sense that we are Hindus, this is our own country, why don't we own up to it? Now, we can go to whether that's right or wrong, but I need you to explain to us and to the hall what went wrong with Indian secularism that there is so much anti-secular feeling.
Gosh, that's a tough one. By the way, are we audible at the back? No, we're not. I get the sense that this sound system needs to be tuned up a bit if somebody has the controls, because clearly when Vir was speaking, I was getting a sense that everything wasn't reaching the back of the room. If either of us turns out to be less audible, please tell us. Vir has raised a number of issues in one question. The first is certainly the kind of India in which we both grew up, and we are rough contemporaries, was certainly an India in which the religious issue was not an issue. I mean, I went to school in Bombay in the 60s, Calcutta in the late 60s and early 70s, and then college in Delhi in the early to mid 70s. And frankly, that India was one in which the assumption had been very clear. Even if Pakistan had been created as a homeland for some of India's Muslims, what remained was going to be a homeland for everybody. And at no stage did the Indian nationalist movement buy into the logic of partition, that religion could be a valid determinant for nationhood. It was drilled into us, all those cliches about national integration and so on, that we had to overlook differences of community, caste, creed, religion, all that stuff, in being better Indians. And this was something that many of us could take for granted. My father was from that nationalist generation that came of age around the time of independence. He would never mention the caste or religion of any of the friends who came home to play. I was blissfully unaware that I had such a motley collection of friends until much later, when circumstances made us more aware of the identities that lurked behind people's names, that I realized that trooping through the parties and the evenings at my home had been Parsis, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and various varieties of Hindus, and that at no point had this difference ever been mentioned to me. And I'm sure that it was the same for Vir and for many others. Having said all of that, we kind of took it for granted. In fact, it was quite interesting the extent to which we were so unconscious of this that we didn't perhaps make enough of it when it began to come under threat. And I still remember a conversation with a former colleague of Vir's in the Calcutta stable for which he then worked, whom I used to speak to quite regularly. We used to be friends. And I remember saying to him on a visit in the mid-80s, why do you keep going on and on about secularism? That battle is won. There are other issues to talk about in India. And he said, you know, you're wrong. I have to keep writing about this because this is the biggest threat facing India in the years ahead, and so on. And sure enough, he turned out to be absolutely right. Within a few years of that conversation, we had the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, the riots that preceded the demolition of the mosque and the poisonous aftermath thereof, all of which have changed these attitudes fundamentally. The only irony and footnote of that conversation is the person who had that conversation with me is now in the BJP and is the minister of that government. But that suggests that that one can be right sometimes and still do the wrong thing later. That's another conversation. Now, Vir asks what went wrong with Indian secularism, and I've only given part of the answer. Perhaps we took it too much for granted. That it just was who we were, and we didn't have to fight for it. Very clearly, we do have to fight for the things we value, because if we don't, others who care more passionately about the opposite will come and take them away. But there is, I think, implicit in Vir's question, the idea that perhaps there are things that that should have been done differently if we wished to preserve secularism. And I think it's important for us who have identified ourselves with the cause of a plural India to admit where we went wrong. And perhaps amongst the things that went wrong were what some Hindus, not only the bigoted Hindus of the Hindutva brigade, as I tend to call them, but other more reasonable-minded people would still say was double standards. That, you know, we lived in a society where it was perfectly all right for a Christian to say, I'm proud to be a Christian, for a Muslim to say, I'm proud to be a Muslim, and for a Hindu to say, I'm proud to be secular. I mean, that was the essential prevailing ethos. And that, as a result, you had a situation where minority institutions, for example, were free from various kinds of government intervention, various laws didn't apply to them, various tax obligations didn't apply to them, whereas Hindu temples could be run by the government, indeed could be taken over for practical purposes by the government, administered by a board appointed by the government, their revenues could be taken over by the government, and so on. So these kinds of double standards had created some grounding to which not enough attention was paid. I think it was with the best of intentions. The assumption was that the majority by definition is secure because it's a majority. It's the minorities in a society, a pluralist society, who have every reason to feel insecure, and therefore one must be particularly attentive to the special needs they have. But at the same time, to say that we were, as a result, perhaps somewhat oblivious to the growing resentment and that manifested itself eventually in a rather savage backlash against this approach, is, I think, perhaps to state the obvious. It is true. Now, does that mean that there's anything justified about the backlash and the forms it's taken? Clearly not. Because when Dr. Manmohan Singh said, for example, that in a society like ours, the minority should have the first claim on the nation's resources, he was pilloried by the Hindutva a lot, but he was saying something that would be sort of, you know, secularism 101 in other plural societies. When Nehru said that the majoritarianism or the nationalism of the majority is far more dangerous for a society than a nationalism that embraces everyone. He was absolutely right. Because in India, the so-called minorities, 20% of the population are 250 million people. That's not a number of people to be trifled with, ignored, marginalized, or otherwise made to feel irrelevant. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I'm sorry you're getting competition from behind the screen there. We are getting competition for your hearing. But in any case, those things, if that's what you meant by your question, are fair, and we have to face up to them and move past them. And my own book, in some ways, is an attempt in saying we don't have to deny our Hinduness. We just have to challenge the way in which the Hindutva laws are interpreting what Hinduism is all about.
One more question about the Hindu backlash, and then we'll move on. One of the suggestions is that your party has always liked being fair to minorities, partly because of sort of high-minded reasons you gave, but also because it's easy to get them to vote in a bloc. For instance, it's been alleged, and said quite often, that you're much more accommodating of, say, the Muslim clergy and dismissive of the Hindu clergy. And it's not just your party, perhaps that's true of the left. I see the Sriman Nasreen sitting in the first row. The left has had problems with her, not because they disagree with her freedom of speech or whatever, but because there has been voluble opposition to her from a certain kind of Muslim extremist background. So isn't that one of the reasons why there is a Hindu backlash?
To some degree, you're asking the wrong person, because I've been an equal
This is why I'm asking you.
You know, an equal opportunity offender. I have denounced the Hindutva lot for their intolerance, but I've equally denounced the ban on Salman Rushdie's book. I've denounced the bans on Taslim Nasreen at the time that they happened, not just in convenient retrospect. I have been totally committed to defending the freedom of speech of every individual in our society, indeed including people who have sought refuge in our society, as Taslima had, because I believe that's what we're all about, and that's what our Constitution stands for. And therefore, I'm happily not guilty of pandering only to one side of this debate. Having said that, there is something we all have to recognize about the nature of our society and our polity as reflected in the Constitution, which is we are not, say, unlike the US, for example, we are not a democracy that recognizes only individual rights. We are a peculiar sort of democracy that we recognize both individual rights and community rights. The entire notion of personal law, for example, essentially says that a community can govern itself through a set of laws that don't apply to any other community. But our notion of individual rights gives to every individual who may be ascribed an identity in that community the right to opt out. So you don't, if you're a Muslim, you don't have to marry under Muslim personal law. You can choose as an individual Muslim to marry under civil law if you so wish. And then any divorce, inheritance issues and so on will be governed by the latter. But if you marry under Muslim personal law and years later you seek relief under civil law, that's when problems come. So this is not a phenomenon in the US. It is not yet in many other European countries, so increasingly there are demands for personal law in those countries from substantial numbers of Muslims. But in India, it's always been there from the very start. So it would be idle for us to pretend that the Congress Party or any other party has to ignore Muslims as a bloc and only stand up for Muslims' individual rights, because that may seem ideal from a certain liberal perspective, but in fact is not reflective of the constitutional provisions of this country. And therefore I would say that that yes, political parties should stand up for individual rights. I'm proud of my own personal record of having done so. But political parties have to respect group rights because the system guarantees them those rights. And then if you take the third step and say, but then you were trying to get them to vote for you as a bloc, the fact is that if group identities translate into a certain collective position, then it would be foolish of any political party not to take advantage of it. After all, what is the Hindutva law doing right now? Before every by-election in the last 4 years, they've been essentially trying to promote polarization within the Hindu community of that particular area on the grounds or on the assumption that the Hindu majority, if sufficient numbers of them buy into the polarization, will guarantee them a victory for their kind of beliefs. So it's not as if it's only the Congress that is guilty of quote-unquote seeking bloc allegiances of a particular community, when the present ruling party is doing the same for the majority of the voters in this country.
So when you say it's not only the Congress that is seeking bloc votes, other people are, you are implicitly admitting the Congress does this?
No, I'm implicitly saying, look, for example, let's take an election in a state or a district or even one constituency where religious tensions are inflamed. Would it not be common sense for the Liberal candidate to appeal, particularly in Muslim localities, because he knows that they're the ones feeling aggrieved or insecure or threatened? Now, you can accuse him of then seeking Muslim votes as a bloc, but it's common political logic that says if a section of people have been made to feel vulnerable by others, then if you stand up for their rights, they will all be inclined to vote for you. Now, of course, our politics is even more complicated than that view, because say if this were UP, you would have at least 2 or 3 parties communicating for the votes of the insecure minority, and perhaps only one clamoring for the votes of the triumphant majority. And that may have partly explained some of the things that have gone wrong, from my point of view, not perhaps those of others, in our politics in the last 7 years.
Anyone who reads the book and has read your writings will know that you're a person who's always argued for a uniform civil code. Whenever there have been controversies, the Slima is one, the satanic verses are one, the Shahbanu case is one, you've always been on what's been broadly seen as the liberal position. When you wrote this book and you set out to reclaim Hinduism, you did it from the perspective of a secular liberal. So explain to us what you meant.
Well, there are a few problems in all that, because on the Uniform Civil Code, or the Universal Civil Code, I actually have a slightly more nuanced position than Vir so kindly said, because what I've said is, I'm in favor of it, it's a desirable objective, but it cannot be imposed on people against their will, and therefore you need to bring every community along with it.
But you are in favor of it.
I'm in favor of it, provided it's not being imposed on others. If substantial voices of minority communities say we are against it because we don't want our personal laws to disappear, I don't think that as a political representative of this country that I should be thrusting it unwillingly upon them, least of all on the basis of a majority vote of just the majority.
That's why I said, if it's not a Hindu law imposed on the country, if it's a genuine uniform person law and a process of consultation leads to a consensus, you would be all right.
Of course, that makes a lot of sense. On the second aspect of your question, the substance is totally accurate. But I will admit that for over 20 years I have been arguing that the word secular is a bit of a misnomer. If you go back to my 1997 book, India from the Midnight of the Millennium, I already make the point there. If you look at a dictionary in the English language, secular actually implies distancing from religion. Nehru was secular. He did not have any particular religious belief or beliefs. He certainly had no patience for Maulvis or sadhus. And as far as he was concerned, he was secular in that he wanted everyone to have a scientific temper and to live by modern rational precepts. Many Indians, arguably a vast majority of Indians, are not secular in that sense. Yeah. But many who are deep believers, and when I say deep believers, I mean in Bengal, for example, where I spent my high school years, and I think you spent your early working life, it was amusing to see Indian atheism at work, because the youth wings of the two communist parties would compete with each other to put up the most lavish puja pandals for the goddess Durga during the Durga pujas. And they are both parties officially pledged to atheism and declaring that religion is the opium of the masses and so on. So clearly it was an implicit recognition that religion's roots in Indian society are far too deep for atheism to have any electoral appeal. And the same thing has happened in the South, the DMK and the ADMK in Tamil Nadu, which are officially atheists and in practice not. So having said that, most Indians are not secular in the dictionary sense of the term, but are secular in the sense of refusing to allow religion to dictate their political choices, to dictate the way they relate to people of other religions, or to even have a dominant place in their mental makeup. They are religious, but it's essentially between them and their God, and as far as they're concerned, they are secular in the sense that they don't particularly want to see religion dominating any of these decisions. They don't want the government to be favoring one particular religion. So I sort of redefined Indian secularism in that book as one that privileges a profusion of religions, provided none of them is patronized by or supported by the state. And that definition of secularism, I would say the vast majority of Indians are either instinctively or afterthought secular. Now, pluralism might be a simpler word because it simply accepts the plural nature of our people. I've often joked that the singular thing about India is that you can only speak of it in the plural. We all exist in 1,000 variants, and therefore pluralism is natural and instinctive in our society. But yes, I do approach India's issues very much from the point of view of a convinced pluralist, or if you would like to call it a secularist, and certainly as a liberal. And by liberal I mean that I, as an attitude of mine, not just of political belief or of economic preference, I see my liberalism as so deeply ingrained in the kind of person I am. I accept human beings as I find them. I don't tend to judge them. I have absolutely no problem with them being, saying, becoming whatever they wish to be, say, or become, provided it doesn't hurt others. That's my only yardstick, and that's the sort of liberalism that I think most Indians, without giving it much thought, will instinctively practice. Now you ask me, why did I write this book in that case? Well, the answer is that Hindus who have a fairly decent reflective or unreflective commitment to their faith can still be secular in this sense of the term. That is, that it's entirely possible to be quite devout, to practice certain tenets of your faith and so on, and still be very comfortable in engaging with others of other faiths. I've talked about this great line of Swami Vivekananda, who in his historic Chicago address of 1893 to the World Parliament of Religions, said that Hinduism is a religion that teaches not just tolerance but acceptance. And I thought that was a profoundly interesting insight, because tolerance, which has rightly been held up as a virtue to all, is ultimately a very patronizing idea, because tolerance says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas acceptance says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And that's a very good basis to get along in a plural society. It's also instinctively hardwired into the DNA of Hinduism. And that's why I felt that this kind of Hinduism, the Hinduism of Vivekananda rather than that of Mohan Bhagwat or M.S. Golwalkar, needs to be recaptured or reasserted. Perhaps recaptured is the wrong word because I'm not prepared to concede yet that my faith has been captured entirely by the bigots, the extremists who have taken over the public articulation of Hinduism. But certainly, I think it's time we reasserted what Hinduism stands for, and it's not Hindutva.
You talked about a colleague of mine having a conversation with you in the 1980s. I remember I had another conversation around the same time with Dr. Karan Singh. At that stage, I don't think was a member of the Congress Party. He started the Virat Hindu Sun. He's, as you know, a great scholar of Hinduism. And the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was just taking off. And I asked him what he made of it as a Hindu scholar, and I wondered if he was for it. And he said, no, it worried him deeply, because this was not Hinduism as he recognized it. He said, this is the Semitization of Hinduism. It's extremist Hinduism, unlike the kind that's ever existed in the history of Hinduism. It's a nasty, aggressive, intolerant Hinduism. And he said, and I realized this, he said it's a very masculine, macho form of Hinduism. He says, you talk about Ram, but nowhere in the Ram Janmabhoomi movement is any reference made to Sita. It's seen as an aggressive, masculine kind of thing. And he said, if you don't watch out, it'll take over India. And guess what happened?
He was totally right. Actually, the Virat Hindu Sammelan was not meant to be the Vishnu. It was really meant to be an alternative and a far more liberal accommodation one. He said something very profound when he launched this book a month ago. He was asked something along these lines about the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and he didn't give the marvelous answer you've just given. But he did say that as a Hindu, I would love to be able to worship at the birthplace of Ram, but I would never have wanted to destroy somebody else's place of worship in order to accomplish that. And that's very much the Hindu instinct. I mean, I think that one has to recognize that a great wrong was done, and that ultimately one can never satisfactorily build a right on that wrong.
Why do you suppose, and coming back to Dr. Karan Singh, who I know was in conversation with you at the launch of your book, coming back to what he said, have we ever had this kind of situation in the history of Hinduism, this kind of politicization of Hinduism, this kind of targeting of minorities, ultimately in an effort to win political power? This is unprecedented, surely.
It is actually unprecedented, and what's very interesting is that it has evolved really since the 80s, in tandem with the political fortunes of the current ruling party. I know that there are many diplomats and ambassadors here, and we should try and keep this above politics, but it's important to understand the context, since Vir has asked the question up front. It is a fact that there is a traceable parallel between the rise of this intolerant form of Hindutva and the rise in parallel in the number of seats of the BJP in the National Parliament. And that goes to the heart of my assertion that Hindutva is nothing to do with religion. It is about a political ideology. It is about the definition of Hindus not through what they believe, but through who they are. It is identity being exploited for political ends. You create an identity and you ask for votes in its name, and if that identity is numerous enough and you can manufacture sufficient threats and anxieties around it, your votes will keep going up. And I'm sorry to say this has successfully happened, but there's got to be a ceiling somewhere. And what's very interesting is that many of us assumed that ceiling had been reached with the 25% that Mr. Vajpayee had won, which then dropped in 2004 to about 19%. What was interesting about that was that we were again taking some things for granted too early, because in fact what happened was that the BJP, with its Hindutva ideology very much at the core, realized that it was possible to attract a larger percentage of votes with the development message tacked on top of the Hindutva ideology. And that development message, I think, is what pushed Mr. Modi from the last 19% the BJP had to the 31% that propelled him to a two-thirds majority in the Lok Sabha. Now, when you do that, however, you then have to perform against a new yardstick. It's no longer enough to play the politics of identity, because that doesn't account for your whole vote. You have to fulfill the politics of performance. And it's their failure to do that that I think is going to undermine the first half of their project. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I'm fairly convinced now that just as the central paradox about Mr. Modi's prime ministership has been that he seemed to articulate a certain development message, a certain performance message, his reliance upon the stormtroopers of Hindutva would undermine that message. That, I thought, was always a central paradox. I'm proud to say I wrote it in December 2014 in my book India Shastra, a few copies of which appear to be available outside. So it's not a retrospective assessment, I wrote it then. That's turned out to be exactly what's happened. Because in order to retain the support of these people, he has pandered to them by allowing them to unleash the forces of bigotry, intolerance, and misbehavior in many parts of northern India. And as a result, he has undermined the development message, which was what got him the extra votes that put him in power. It's an impossible feat to pull off, and I don't think it can be pulled off any longer.
Because his election campaign was essentially, you heard about my social agenda, that's nonsense, it's Congress propaganda, let's talk about development. And he's been elected, and all we actually now hear is the social agenda, not the development agenda.
Totally right.
Yeah. So what happens in the year ahead? We're coming up to general election. You have in Bengal, in Bihar, nearly everywhere you look, a communalization that has led to violence. Do you see these as a difficult 12 months for India in the months ahead?
I'm afraid so. And again, you know, one doesn't want to keep on saying, I told you so, but many of us have been warning that this would be, that just as the development message failed, had development succeeded, which would have been a good thing for all of us because we're all Indians, we want to see India prosper. Had the development message succeeded, this would not have been necessary. But with the development message faltering completely, because you can be a wonderfully effective salesman, a great rhetorician, an orator, but if you're selling an empty package and people realize you're selling an empty package, they won't buy it. And so the development package is no longer being bought, essentially because people have realized that over 4 years not there. Well, the 18, 19-year-old in UP, and there were a few million of them of that category, who voted for Mr. Modi in 2014 because he promised them 2 crore jobs a year. Are they going to vote for him again 5 years later when they're not even 2 lakh jobs going? I mean, these are questions that they'll have to face, and therefore they're now falling back on their core agenda, what you call the social, I would call it the anti-social agenda, of actually polarizing opinion around identity. And the identity message, I'm sorry to say, has been manufactured in those ways. Look what just happened in Bengal, where you have a bunch of young, I won't know if they're sober or not, but extremely sort of deliriously angry young men brandishing trishuls and saffron flags, marching provocatively through a Muslim neighborhood shouting slogans. I mean, if they wanted to celebrate some occasion or shout their slogans if they wanted to, they could have done so anywhere else. But they chose to do it in a locality where someone was bound to get provoked, a provocation occurred, violence for which these guys were prepared then erupted, and indeed the most people who died were Muslims, but there's now fear on both sides, and the resultant polarization leads some people to hope that if communities vote along community lines, then the 80% community will always do better than the 20% community. That's sort of the thinking of the ruling party. Now, in Bengal, actually, the numbers are a bit different. It's more like 60-40. In other parts of India, it is certainly closer to 80-20. And therefore, the dangerous formula, they believe, is what's going to tip them over the top. I think it's time that the media and others and the right-thinking citizens of this country called out the strategy for what it is and said, this cannot be allowed to go on. This is destroying the fabric of our nation. At the end, does anybody want to be, quote-unquote, governing a smoldering heap of ashes?
Your former president asked at the India Today Conclave in Bombay about Rahul Gandhi visiting temples and all of that, said it was a deliberate strategy because a view had been propounded, bought by a lot of people, that the Congress was anti-Hindu. And the attempt was to make it clear, we're not anti-Hindu, we're not anti any religion, we are proud, those of us who are Hindus, of being Hindus. We just don't think it should mix with politics. Do you want to expand on that?
Right, but that's exactly, I'm sorry the book is not visible here because
that is
traffic and didn't go and pick up a copy. But anyway, the fact is that, that's what the book is about in many ways. It's precisely this argument that we need to neutralize the somewhat cynical arguments of the BJP that we're the only party that speaks for Hindus, that represents Hindus, and that Hindus should therefore vote for. Because in fact there are Hindus in all parties, and as far as my party is concerned, there are many people who consider themselves, as you mentioned Dr. Karan Singh was an outstanding example, far more knowledgeable about Hinduism than many of the people who profess it with so much ignorance in the ruling party. The fact is, however, that we haven't been making this argument. We have by default allowed one, so we've ceded the space, if you like, to one political party on one side of it. And it was time for us to start saying, hey, wait a minute. They say they're Hindu, we're also Hindu, and let's get that out of the way and talk about development. And that was what Rahul Gandhi was doing by going to the temples. That's what I'm doing, publishing my book. Let us not surrender the Hindu space, such as it is, to one set of people who, by the way, are defining Hinduism down to something which is, in many ways, which has traded the soaring majesty of the Upanishads and the Vedas and the metaphysical inquiries of Hinduism into something more akin to the team loyalty of the British football hooligan. You know, it's my team is better than your team and I'll hit you on the head if you disagree. That's the sort of Hinduism they're propagating. And it's not Hinduism for many of us. But be that as it may, what we're saying is, okay, so they claim they're doing whatever they're doing as good Hindus. We're good Hindus too. Now let's talk about what happened to Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. That's the political logic.
It certainly is hard to reconcile the Hinduism of the great sages, the people who wrote the Upanishads, with Yogi Adityanath. That's a very different kind of Hinduism.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to throw this open. Any questions? I think there are microphones. You will get microphones. There is a microphone going around. So please put your hands up and ask whatever you like. I think you have to choose who you want to get.
And please identify.
The mic,
so
the mic can be the traffic.
Dr. Tharoor can choose whoever.
No.
That's unfair.
I will choose. We'll keep all the tough questions. Please stand up, identify yourself, and then ask your question.
Please.
My name is Jyoti Pandey. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you.
I love your writings. My question really is, going forward, what is it that we can do to claim our version of our religion back from this communized, communalized version that has been taken over by the Hindutva, so to speak? And the other thing is, I just wanted to share this. I was in Mysore recently, and I just wanted to share this little thing on my tour. My tour guide was telling me that this American woman was telling him about how India would do so well if it treated religion like underwear. Don't share it and don't show it. And that would really make us go forward. But I'd really like to know, going forward, what is the solution? Because I don't think that the Congress lost because it was only siding with the minority, so to speak. I think it lost because it had lost the plot, it was corrupt, it was not doing anything on any area in any,
Or at least there was a perception that they were.
No, it was.
He says quickly. Yeah.
So this is what, and I totally agree with you that Modi ji won because of he won mainly because of developmental agenda, and people like me who felt that this will be better are so disappointed. We want to know what to do going forward.
Okay, so on the first part of your question, I mean, I think each of us will have to answer for ourselves. I'm trying to reclaim the space through my writings and my speaking about these issues. And one could argue that as a political figure, at least in Thiruvananthapuram and to some degree on the national stage, I have been trying to advance these ideas on those platforms. So to that degree, that's what I'm doing. Others, I hope, will do more of the same, because very clearly the trends that Vir and I have been talking about are damaging in the long term for the country, and those who disagree with them need to reclaim that space. Those of you who are not in political life or in public life can reclaim the space in your private conversations, in your workplaces, and in your voting habits. All of that would be important. On the point about why Congress lost, I agree there was a perfect storm of a number of factors. Certainly the India Against Corruption movement had seized the imagination of many, and because the Congress was in power, got saddled with the blame for everything. But as sadly we have seen since, no one party in this country has either a monopoly on corruption or a monopoly on virtue. There are endemic faults in our system, economic, social, cultural even, that we all need to overcome, and that's a different issue. And thirdly, when you say what should we do about how do we take this forward, I have to be political in my answer. I think we really need to send a very clear signal to those who have thought that profiting from this form of bigotry and dividing the nation is the way forward. We have to send a very clear signal as voters, as members of the Indian public, that we value the idea of India we had before, an India that belongs equally to everyone, an India to which everyone has contributed, an India where, as we put it at the beginning, it's not that one set of people own it and everybody else is a guest or an interloper, which is the Hindutva view of India, but rather an India to which everybody has every right to contribute, to belong, to assert their rights. Now, we can all show that in our daily life and in our conduct, but politically it becomes very necessary to also show it at the ballot box, because when that next opportunity comes, if we fail to exercise it, to preserve this pluralist India, we may never get another chance. And I don't mean to be too alarmist, but all you need to do essentially to change the constitution is have majorities in both houses and 2/3 of the states. At the moment, the BJP has a majority, 2/3 majority in Lok Sabha, but is only creeping up towards, it has just become the largest single party in the Rajya Sabha, but not yet a majority. However, since the Rajya Sabha is elected by the states, the fact that it controls 20 states, rules 22, means that it's not long before it takes over the Rajya Sabha. If that happens while it still controls the Lok Sabha, the constitution, as far as I'm concerned, is not going to survive in its present form. We will be a different country. And I think it's important to understand that if people in this country are conscious of how serious the threats are, and have also are conscious, if you voted on economic grounds, that the economic performance has not justified your faith in the economic delivery capability of these people, then you have two solid reasons not to allow them to come back again to power.
Can I take a question to the next logical step, which I think she maybe have been too polite to say? Many people who believe in liberalism and secularism agree with everything you say, and believe, as you suggest, that the BJP poses some kind of threat to the continuance of a certain kind of India. But they also feel, as angry as they may be with the BJP, angry with the Congress, because they feel it was your ineptitude, to use her phrase, your corruption, your lack of any decision making, your obsession with dynasty that allowed the BJP in. And they ask, are you chaps in a position to give them a fight this time?
Yes.
That was your question, really, no? Shorn of all the polite stuff, yeah.
Yes, we can't accuse any television anchor in our country of being excessively polite. No, I think the answer to that is something we have to demonstrate in action. Very clearly, what the last 4 years have demonstrated is that certainly the economic competence of successive Congress governments has vastly exceeded that of the fabled CEO of Gujarat Inc., who's running our economy today. Secondly, that the very deep and experienced bench strength of the Congress, and people have demonstrated competence in previous governments, is far greater than the handful of performers in the BJP ranks. And that too is important to appreciate. And thirdly, that if Congress allowed corruption on its watch, sadly so has the BJP. And a lot of the corruption that takes place in our system has rather become so deeply entrenched in the system that nothing short of a systemic change and a cultural change in attitudes is going to eliminate it. One reason, for example, is that our system gives lots of people the opportunity to profit from, for example, the power to permit something or the other. Culturally, many Indians, and after all, no corrupt acts can take place without a giver and a taker. And in many cases, the giver gives in order to short-circuit certain processes, win certain favors, bypass certain procedures, etc., in their own short-term interest, and also in the cultural conviction that if they don't do it, their rival will. So they may as well do it and get the favor they want. Without such givers, there would be no takers. There could be no takers. So in fact, every time you point your finger at the Congress, you're also pointing three fingers at yourself. I mean, I don't mean you personally, I mean us as a society. And this is something we all have to grapple. In some ways, I think of Anna Hazari's movement as a wasted opportunity. If instead of pushing this Lokpal bill, which I still think is very fundamentally flawed, that has now been passed and therefore should be implemented, and hasn't been for 4 years by this government, the fact is that if he had simply asked everybody in any of his well-attended rallies to stand up and swear solemnly to never give a bribe, forget about taking one. If everybody all over the country was serious about not countenancing this by the act of giving, we might actually we might have been able to bring about a behavioral change in this society. But sadly, the giving and the taking continues, and I really, honestly, I don't say this with any special pleading. I don't think that it's particularly the Congress. They happened to be in power for 10 years, everything was stuck on them. Now, from Nirav Modi to Lalit Modi to God knows whichever other Modis are around, it's being stuck on somebody else. So the fact is that this is a problem that the society has to deal with, and not just the polity.
Somebody Dr. Tharoor, I know you very well, and I'm Dr. Vivek Gupta, I'm a cardiologist in Apollo Hospital, but I have a lot of interest in all these subjects with which you are asking. I'm a Hindu, and I have a lot of friends who are Muslims. In fact, I have nothing against them, and I feel that they are part of our family. But at the same time, I feel that 80% of our Indian Muslims are actually converted from what we were Hindus, and everybody knows it. So when there was a sort of a thought process, Ghar Wapsi, what do you think about this slogan, which was actually enterprised too much by the political parties, which was propagated by RSS, and I don't think anything wrong in that, at least those who want to do it. What is your thought process in this? Because I feel that they were Hindus, and they have a lot of friends here. So what do you think about politically? I'm talking of non-political thought process, not a political thought process.
Well, I think first of all, there's a logical inconsistency in arguing that converting out of Hinduism was bad, but converting back to Hinduism is good. Ultimately, conversion is and should be an individual choice, sometimes a family choice, and if it has happened, then it is for the individual or the family to decide for themselves that this is no longer good enough. There actually was an interesting Ghar Wapsi movement that no one has actually written and talked about in the 60s and 70s in southern Karnataka, in the Bangalore area, amongst a lot of Christians who said that we want to go back to Hinduism because our ancestors were forcibly converted by the Portuguese. And you'll find there's still a few families who have added Prabhu to their surnames. So they have Christian name, Joseph de Souza Prabhu, or James de Silva Prabhu, that kind of thing. There are quite a few such families who said that they wanted, and that died out, the movement died out, and that was that. But it's not unprecedented that out of their own conviction, whether out of historical factors or whatever, they felt they should do it. But what would be, I think, deeply embarrassing, I mean, you know what happened, the one Ghar Wapsi incident that made it to the front pages of our newspapers was when a bunch of bewildered Muslims in Agra were converted in a ceremony that they weren't quite sure what was going on. And they turned out subsequently to be a lot of Bangladeshi illegal immigrants who thought that by accepting this they would be able to stay on in India. Now, it unfortunately makes a mockery out of what religious faith should be all about. I have always felt that I have no difficulty with any individual who doesn't feel their spiritual yearnings are satisfied by the faith in which they happen to find themselves. If they would then want to learn about another faith and choose to switch to it, that should be their privilege. And I have no difficulty with Hinduism advertising its virtues to those who might be perhaps inclined to consider that. But I have a real problem in putting the mechanisms of the state or aggressive NGO activity. And don't forget, this Ghar Wapsi movement was happening at the same time as the rather belligerent references to anti-nationals. And the whole thing was that somehow to be a good Indian, you had to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, you had to reject certain kinds of political thinking, and you had to also come back to the mother faith. That I have a problem with, because I don't think that's what India is all about. I think we should be a country where a Muslim should be comfortable in being a Muslim without feeling in any way threatened by it. I've often argued that the strength about India's many identities is that they're all safe at the same time, that you can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, a good Indian all at once. And in some ways, you're safe as a good Muslim and as a good Keralite because you're an Indian. And that the protecting carapace of the Indian identity allows all your other identities to flourish as well. That was the strength of, if you like, the Nehruvian version of India. Nehru described India as a palimpsest. I'm not assuming everyone here knows what a palimpsest is, but
This is another Faragha text.
I know, I go and write on a wall, and Vir comes and writes on top of what I've written without erasing what I've written. And Shobna comes and writes on top of what Vir has written without erasing what either of us has written. And the ambassador there comes and writes on top of hers, and so on and so forth. All of this together is a palimpsest. It can be a writing, it can be a painting, it can be a drawing, but it's the accretion of different contributions, none of which erases what has gone before. And that is ultimately what India is all about. So many different influences, peoples, and religions have come into this country and made their contributions, have perhaps been eclipsed, have perhaps continued, and they all belong. That idea of India is a very precious idea, because it's the one thing that enables us to live comfortably with each other without any one of us feeling somehow marked or stigmatized or marginalized or threatened by the rest.
Hello, good evening. My name is Reshma Sharma Punj. I'm a proud Kashmiri Hindu Pandit. Has it ever occurred to you that actually your party might be responsible for the uprising Hindutva movement? I'll just give you an example.
You remember Vir's question earlier in the evening was precisely that.
I'll just give you an example. Imagine you're not Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Imagine you're Dr. Shashi Tharoor. You've been born and brought up in Kashmir, okay? And imagine while growing up, you were constantly taunted and said, you're told, "Wapas jao apne mulk." And you'd say, "No, this is my country." No, India is your country. This is not your country. Imagine the same children that you played with, seeing them get married, you all got married. Their children you've seen being born. You've gone to their birthdays, subsequently you've gone to their weddings. And you were told that you have 24 hours to pack up everything and leave. Otherwise, you'll pay with your life. Now you tell me at that time, is that Hindu meant to think, you know what, I should be secular? Or is that Hindu meant to think, my God, has it really come to this? We're second-class citizens in our own country. And your party, what I'm saying is that your party is responsible for that. And what do you think you can do?
How would you say the party is responsible particularly for that?
Totally responsible for it, because what you fail to realize is that now we are a minority, you see, so you should be thinking of the Hindus, the Hindus in Kashmir, and you should be now thinking of doing something for us, because that is what your party specializes in, you see.
All right, let me respond. You spoke from the heart, and I'll respond from the heart as well. My late wife was a Kashmiri Pandit, and I know the story of her family intimately from its own members and victims. She too grew up there. Her family was driven out in '89. The home she'd grown up in as a child, was destroyed. We went back to a village. And I have to admit, we went under protection, because it was in an area which is north of Sopor, a very high militancy area. But when she entered the villagers, now of course every one of them a Kashmiri Muslim, came out and embraced her with great affection. The wet nurse who had nursed her as a child, as a baby, because her mother was ill and couldn't nurse her, wept in her arms, said, "When are you coming back?" And of course, the mound on which had once stood the family mansion was just a grassy pile. There's nothing left. Every stone had been stolen. She had this dream of rebuilding the house there. But despite all the emotional rebuilding, she realized that if you can't even go and visit without protection, you're not going to be able to live there, because even if your own neighbors, the ones who knew you as children, may stand by you, they will not be able to prevent others coming in and doing you harm. So that is a terrible situation. I don't know why you particularly blame the Congress Party, because I do know that she bitterly blamed Governor Jagmohan for having told the pundits to leave, that you cannot be protected, and thereby having triggered the exodus. And I realize that this is a controversial view and there are other views, but I know the way her family and she personally felt about it. She engaged in a rather bitter exchange with Governor Jagmohan when he was still alive, and she was still alive 3 years ago. So I don't mean, I personally at first hand, as it were, experienced the loss and pain you describe. Could it have been prevented by politics? I'm not sure, and I'll say why. This happened at a time when a number of forces beyond India's control were on the ascendant. In 1988-89, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan came to an end. Vast numbers of mujahideen had been pumped into that area, into Afghanistan, who were suddenly unemployed, and the ISI directed them towards Kashmir. It was a level of firepower that was augmented by a considerable amount of ammunition, guns, weaponry, with which the place was awash, and which had largely been financed by those countries, notably the US, that were trying to put these in the hands of those who were fighting to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So we were suddenly facing a different order of rebellion. It wasn't mainly Kashmiris. 90% of the militants, terrorists, etc. coming in were non-Kashmiris diverted from the Afghan struggle. Secondly, and this is an area where you can blame the Congress Party, there is very little doubt that the 87 elections in Kashmir were badly mishandled, that some level of rigging took place to ensure a victory for Farooq Abdullah, and that at that point a number of young Kashmiri hotheads became disillusioned and crossed the border looking for weapons. This combination of factors, happening at a time of Islamist resurgence globally, gave us a challenge that was very difficult to fulfill. The reason that pundits could be driven out of homes they lived in for millennia, not just centuries, is because these forces were so large and so irresistible that they were beyond the capacity of the government of India at that time to control. Now, one can argue, some would argue, and my late wife would have argued, that India should immediately reinforce the forces and made protection of the Kashmiri Pandit homes one of their mission statements. It wasn't. Some others have since argued that you should have regrouped Pandits in certain areas to make it easier to defend them. That would have defeated the very logic of them all staying in their homeland, in their own homes, amongst their own communities. It's difficult to argue there's been a better solution. I see that you've chosen to blame the Congress Party, but have things in any way been handled differently under either the 6 years of the BJP government earlier or the 4 years of the BJP government today? I think on these issues, the Indian state does not divide on political party grounds. I think we all want to see, first of all, the rights of the Kashmiri Pandits respected and restored. We all want to see a Kashmir at peace, and ideally we want to see a Kashmir in which communities can live together, and therefore pundits, many who are still living in appalling conditions in Jammu, can go back. But each year that passes, and now it's been a generation, it becomes more and more difficult to envisage that. It's very easy to be emotional about this and attack those who say they can't do very much more. But I'd like to look beyond the emotion. I know it's not easy, and I know it wasn't easy for my late wife, to just say, in practical terms, what can the Indian state do today, tomorrow, day after, to appease your anger? And if you can give me concrete suggestions, I'm quite happy to carry them to the new Prime Minister after 2019 election.
Somebody have a question?
So that's all.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Of course you can. Go ahead.
My name is Shashi Tharoor. I heard you all, and I'm extremely, worried. Who am I? Am I a Hindu? Am I an Indian? Or I am just a Muslim? Because I have learned from the day one that as an Indian, I don't have to be just a Muslim. I am a Hindu as much as a Muslim, because in 1,000 years, my Islam, was accepted, and it did accept everything which is Indian. Bhagavad Gita tells me that you are a Hindu, and I'm very happy to be a Hindu. Then the Supreme Court also told me that I'm a Hindu because culturally I'm a Hindu. But my friend here says I have to go for Dharmapsi. My ancestors were cowards who were such cowards that they converted, they ran away from Hinduism. That's what I'm told all the time on Twitter. That your ancestors were the cowards, and you were cowards, and you will come back because we are going to force you into Hinduism again. So do I have to become Hindu? Because you did not tell us, and I'm sorry I've not read the book, what is a Hindu? Who is a Hindu? And how can I become a Hindu? That is what I want to know. Another question to ask, but basically my question is, who is a Hindu? What Guruji tells me, what the Supreme Court tells me, or my friend here, and Vishnu Parishad, Bajrang Dal and RSS tells me that Dharmapsi is essential. Am I committing a love jihad because I love fellow Indians, or am I committing a hate jihad because I love fellow Indians? Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to have your voice in this conversation. I must say that as far as I'm concerned, whatever one's ancestors did and when they did it becomes irrelevant to our own lives. Most of us are really conscious only of our own particular lives and sets of beliefs. And if we find ourselves in a particular cultural, religious or social identity as a result of the accident of our birth, it's a very, very, very small minority that actually changes that. How many people convert in the world from any one faith to any other faith? By and large, whatever the reason that you're born a Muslim or born a Hindu, you tend to accept that that's what you are. But the degree to which it defines who you are is up to you. So, you can be fanatic about your religious identity, or you can see it as essentially an issue between yourself and your maker, or whatever image of the cosmic forces that have made you wish to worship. And that's fine. Shayad, I do answer the question of who a Hindu is by saying basically there are many, many ways of being a Hindu. And I talk about my Hinduism, the Hinduism that I have been brought up in, that I have read about, that I've studied, and that I cherish. But I also point out it's entirely possible for there to be a million other ways of being Hindu. And even simply in terms of how you reach out to the Godhead, we have the notion of Bhakti Yoga, which is basically going to temples and worshipping, which some people do as the principal practice of their faith. There's Jnana Yoga, where essentially people read and study the metaphysics of the faith and are Hindu in that way. There's Karma Yoga, where people perform action, service, including social service, as a way of serving God. There's also Raja Yoga, which is an entirely internal practice, where you're essentially looking at your breath, your meditation, your inner soul, to decide what kind of union with God you want to achieve. And all of these parts, it's a very rare soul, a very sort of unusually self-realized person who can follow all four equally. Many of us tend to do more of one and less of another, and that's about it. So in fact, in many, many ways, there is no one answer to how you can be a Hindu, what kind of a Hindu you can be. You can do all of these things, none of these things, some of these things. You can imagine God in 333 million ways. And why is that? Because Hinduism essentially acknowledges that God is unimaginable. Nobody's seen God. Nobody can actually tell you what God looks like. So you're free to imagine him or her in whatever form you find convenient to worship. So if for you God is a woman with 8 arms riding a tiger, that's great. If God is a pot-bellied person with an elephant's head, that's fine. If God is, for that matter, a chap on a crucifix bleeding from his palms, that's okay too. As far as Hinduism is concerned, there's no prohibition against worshipping God in any other form. And the willingness of Hindu thought to embrace even the reform movements against it, the Buddha, Mahavira, even Guru Nanak, many will say, is actually a Hindu reformer. So these were all ways of saying that because every way is valid, your way of interpreting the larger sort of human desire to merge with the cosmos, with the absolute, that is, you're up to you. So you can essentially, and very, very few do, but you can, if you so wish, say, I'm a Muslim, but I'm a Hindu. That's what some in the RSS feel that Muslims should be urged to do. They should be Mohammedan Hindus, is the phrase that Golwalkar and Dindiyal Upadhyay used. The problem with that is, of course, for most Muslims, to say that would be a denial of the essential tenets of their faith. And so the person who, as a Muslim or as a secular Muslim, as some would say, is comfortable in his Indian identity, says, but don't ask me to be something I'm not. And I'm not going to come to your temples and do an arati, so why are you asking me to be a Mohammedan Hindu? I will go and pray in my own way. I will reach out my hands to God when I do my namaz, and that's my way of doing it. I will not say Bharat Mata Ki Jai because my religion doesn't allow me to personalize my country as a goddess, but I will say Jai Hind. To me, that is and should be acceptable. Not just acceptable, but applauded, because that's also a way of being Indian. But unfortunately, for many, it's not good enough. And that is precisely the onus that is being placed on our Muslim fellow citizens. And I think we have to stand up against it, resist it, and reject it. That's what I've been talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. The
Is it
gentleman
okay if I
there.
don't get-
Oh, sorry.
Excuse me, yes.
You have to stand up, sir, even unless this is general form. All right.
I may be forgiven.
All right.
Just one question. The word secular was introduced, if my information is correct, much later, almost after 2 decades and a little more. And so do we understand that the Constituent Assembly or the writers of the Constitution, like Dr. Ambedkar and others, did not respect secularism, or they did not want to use the word secular, or it never crossed their minds, and therefore India was not secular before the word was amended and added to the Constitution?
No, Sonalji. In fact, I've actually written about this. I'll be very happy to send you my article. It is true that the introduction of the words secular, and for that matter socialist, into the preamble of the Constitution took place with the 42nd Amendment in 1976 and has never been removed since. But, as I've argued, and I believe facts support me, the Constitution was already a secular constitution without using the word because of the various provisions in it that can only be fulfilled by, for example, the right to equality, the prohibition on discrimination, the right to life, dignity, and now what the Supreme Court considers the right to privacy, freedom of worship, the freedom of speech. All of this is already in the Constitution from the very beginning. And therefore, de facto, even before the word secular was put in, it was a secular constitution. If you remove the word secular, all these provisions are still there. Excuse me, then we still are very much secular.
So then my counter question would be that what is the problem about removing the word secular? Because it's just overstating something, as you yourself said. India was secular in that sense. So why are people afraid to even discuss it?
No, I think we're not so much afraid of discussing it. I think the fear is that the very nature of the constitution and therefore of the Indian state will be threatened if those who have a different perspective. I mean, let me explain. For example, the core issue with those of us who worry about what the BJP would do given the opportunity, in other words, given the majorities in the two houses and 2/3 of the states, what would they do to the constitution? It's not just deleting the word secular, which I agree would not matter other than symbolically. It would send a signal that will hurt some people, and that's sad. But in and of itself, that alone will not make the constitution unsecular.
That's it. I mean, the other things I don't
You
need
can have
to.
dinner with him later and have a conversation. The people here who don't normally have a chance. So let's ask them.
But let me just finish this thought though, because it's important.
Let's not turn to dialogue, yeah?
No, not so much a dialogue, but just saying that apart from the fact that removing the word secular would not make the constitution not secular, it is however true that their critique of the constitution is far more fundamental. So for example, Dindayal Upadhyay, whose thoughts and whose work and whose ideas are very passionately advocated by our present Prime Minister and the ruling party, and every ministry is supposed to do seminars and forums to study it. He rejected the constitution. He said essentially that the constitution is fundamentally flawed. One set of reasons where it's full of Western ideas, brought in by Anglophone lawyers and Anglophile lawyers and written in the wrong language. And that's a predictable critique, if you like, that we can ignore. But the second and more fundamental critique was that it rests on a flawed premise. What is the flawed premise? The idea of the nation embodied in the Constitution, he says, quoting him almost word for word, is that of a territory called India and all the peoples on it. He says that is wrong. A nation is not a territory, it's a people. And the people here are the Hindu people. And the Constitution must reflect that. So there's a fundamental change they would like to bring about. Now, if that's the kind of change they want to bring about, it will transform this country beyond anything that we have in the articles of the Constitution. That was the fear that I expressed. Secularism, per se, I think can survive the deletion of one word, provided the remaining articles in the Constitution are not tapped.
So basically you concede her point that one word would not make much difference. But you're saying the removal of that one word is actually less innocuous than it appears. There is a whole design and a whole message. That's what you're saying.
That's it.
Is that fair? You're agree, all right. Yeah, gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm Sudhanshu Ranjan.
Yeah.
I'm amazed at the whole discourse and this focus on minoritism and majoritism. Because if we read the history of Congress and freedom movement, on 27th April 1942, when Mahatma Gandhi sent his resolution for the Congress Working Committee, which meeting was going to be held, and he said that this whole question of minority and majority is the creation of the British, which would disappear once they withdraw. It did not happen. Congress ruled for more than 40 or 50 years continuously with an interregnum in 77, 89. I don't have to explain. The Congress party was dubbed as a party of Hindus by the Muslim League, and so much so that when the interim government was being formed, there was a clear warning to the Congress leaders that no Muslims should be nominated by the Congress. And when the interim government was formed with 14 members, there were 2 Muslims, Shafat Ahmad Khan and Sayyid Zahir Ali. And Muslims are so angry that one Muslim fanatic attacked Shafat Khan very next to his knife. He was seriously injured. So a party which is seen as representing Hindu interests suddenly becomes a party which is pandering to the Muslims. And Jawaharlal Nehru is said to have I haven't read the original writing, but I have read many people quoting him that I am an Englishman by training, a Muslim by culture, and a Hindu by the accident of birth. So I don't know what happened, that a perception was created that it is a party which represents Muslim interests, so much so that your party leaders went to the extent of saying that 26/11 was done by the RSS and not by the Pakistani terrorists. Ultimately, your party says that a perception has been created by the BJP that it is a Muslim party, and now your spokesman says that Rahul Gandhi is Janev Dhari, because that is a confirmatory test of being a Hindu. I don't think any political party would venture into going to that, because that alienates OBCs and SCs. So to that extent, the party has gone to profess that it is a Hindu party. Now, one thing about secularism, that it's not only in India, it is worldwide. In Europe also we find that the question is raised on the very utility of multiculturalism. Be it Angela Merkel or the former Prime Minister David Cameron or Nicolas Sarkozy, all raising questions on multiculturalism. So, relating that to India, I would like to ask, has secularism becomes a fool's errand for the Congress, that Sonia Gandhi is forced to say that it is not a party of Muslims, Rahul Gandhi being forced to visit all the temples and going in Karnataka and saying that we shall follow Vaspanna, repeating same what he did in Gujarat. What does all this reflect?
Well, the latter part of your question already covered. It's the first part that we haven't discussed. But the latter part has already been asked by Vir and others we've addressed it, so I won't repeat myself. But on the first part, the historical part, the only counter I can offer you is that from 1885 onwards, the Congress had consistently tried to be a party that embraced everybody. Just look at the first 20 years of presidents of the International Congress. You have Muslims, Christians, Parsis, Hindus and whites as president of the International Congress. So this is a party which consistently tried to affirm that. Similarly, after the Congress is blamed for not having allowed the Muslim League to join the government in UP after the 1937 elections, it said that is the roots of partition, because if we had accommodated the Muslim League, then clearly the Muslim League would never have gone for separatism. Perhaps. But why was the Congress Party unwilling to accommodate the Muslim League? Because it insisted on its right to be the sole representatives of the Muslims of India, a right which it had not earned even by its electoral performance. And so the Congress was expected to accept only Muslim nominees in the ministries from the Muslim League, and not to name Rafi Ahmed Kidwai and Abul Kalam Azad or any other Congress leader. Why should the Congress accept that? The Congress said these are all people who have as much right to be our ministers or be our leaders, because we don't make the distinction on the basis of religion that the Muslim League does. So the Muslim League was rejected not as a partner, or not as a rejection of the Muslim community, but as a rejection of its claim to be the sole representatives of that community. And that continues right through up to the interim government. In fact, Azad and company swallowed their pride and their self-interest in agreeing to stand down and let the League nominate the Muslim members, just in order to allow the interim government to happen. But as you know, the Muslim League then formed the government only to obstruct it from within. And they proceeded at every single opportunity to block the cabinet from deciding anything. And Liaquat Ali Khan, as finance minister, actually prevented the adoption of a budget. So the whole exercise was cynical on their part, whereas I would say the Congress Party at least stood up for the principle that it was there to defend. So my argument is I'm not sure you've been fair to history in that respect.
We're actually way out of time. I'll take two quick questions, sir.
I'm Kamal Moody from Art Carrot. So when we are talking of Hinduism or Hindu, why do we forget about our original word, which is Sanatan? We never talk about that, because that includes every religion in it. When we talk of Sanatan, infinite, Anand, Anadi, जो कभी शुरू ही नहीं हुआ, वो खत्म भी नहीं होगा, चाहे वो सतयुग था या द्वापर या त्रेता या आज कलयुग की बात कर रहे हैं हम लोग. तो जब बात आई सनातन की, what is that infinite, what is that शाश्वत, जो सदा से चला आ रहा है और आज भी चलेगा और चल ही रहा है. So that value is बहुजन हिताय, बहुजन सुखाय. जो सबके सुख के लिए चीज होगी, वही धर्म के रिलीजन में और धर्म की परिभाषा में आएगा. तो हम उसको भूल रहे हैं. आज हमारे ही देश एक ऐसा है जिसमें जब हम सनातन धर्म की बात करते हैं, सब इंक्लूडेड.
I've got the question. You haven't read his book?
Yeah,
the last part of his book is exactly about this.
Yeah, that's what my book talks about.
That's exactly what you said is exactly what his book is.
Thank you.
So do read the book.
You read the book, yes. Sir, the gentleman in the first row.
Can I get the mic, please? Good evening. My name is K.L. Ganju. I'm a friend of Dr. Shashi Tharoor. We have heard a lot of things, from the book to the election to the majority, Garbhapsi, love jihad, many things. But why do we forget one thing? That in spite of the fact, like Dr. Shashi Tharoor said, they got a brute majority in Lok Sabha, but they only got 31% votes. Where are the 69% votes? Congress ruled this country with 30%, 35% votes for 50, 60 years. But when the others realized we have to throw Congress out, then they started uniting. So now the question is, who will unite whom? Whether this dispensation will continue like this, whether if at all we are thinking we are suffering, whether we have to suffer, or the India is growing, I want answer for that. Thank you.
So I will slightly change the question.
Before that, a last one. Answering to the lady's question, I am also a Kashmiri Pandit, a Brahmin, living in India. Like I say living in India, but my grandmother never used to say, I am Indian. She used to say, I am Kashmiri. When she used to come to meet her son, she used to go back and say, where from you come? We have come from India back to my home. That is Kashmir. That is the difference between the older generation and the new generation. We have to like that.
So will you guys unite?
Yeah, I mean, not just the uniting, I mean, I would say on what basis would you unite is also an important question, because if you're going to unite on questions of identity, whether it's the Hindu polarization argument for one set of people, whether it's the religious identity, caste identity for others, if that becomes the only basis for uniting, then it seems to me that we are creating a rather difficult basis for the future of our country as an effective policy, because identities will always be organized around group interests and will compete with each other on the basis of group interests. Whereas if you argue that one can unite around principles and values, then these identities will matter much less, and it can be moving towards a politics of performance, of saying, let us keep this country safe for everybody, let us ensure that the basic facilities are available to everybody, let us ensure everybody can take a couple of square meals a day for granted, that they can have a decent job, a roof over their heads, education for their children, the kinds of things the state should be able to provide and often hasn't. That kind of obligation, if that's what we can unite around, I believe there are enough parties who are prepared to unite behind that. And the challenge is going to be, will they stay united? We well know that if a serious attempt at opposition unity is forged, there will be efforts made to break it. And amongst the efforts made will be to recall the history of the great Janata coalition of 77 that collapsed in 79, the VP Singh coalition 89 that collapsed in 90, the Devgad and Gujarat efforts that collapsed in less than a year and a half each, and finally, of course, in state governments, I think UP has seen various unsuccessful combinations of various parties, none of which lasted a full term. So you can come around and say all these attempts to get together are doomed. I would like to be a little more optimistic than that. I would say that we do need to unite. We do need to unite, and we do, it seems to me, need to unite on principles so we can deliver results for our people, rather than uniting on identity.
So is UPA one a good plan?
Is UPA one a good example of unity that worked?
I thought UPA 1 was actually very effective. It presided over the highest growth rate in the history of democratic India. And it also brought in a number of far-reaching reforms. Nowadays, everyone takes RTI for granted, though I can assure you it's in the process of being hollowed out by our present government. But the fact that every Indian citizen can write on a postcard to the government of India and get an accounting of how their taxes are spent on a particular issue, that is a remarkable accomplishment, came from that government. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Some people fancy, people sneer at it, but it's transformed lives. There are people whose lives it has actually saved. It's ended distress migration out of the villages. It's actually created the phenomenon of rural purchasing power that has actually given decent lives to the village, to the rural poor. All of this happened in the course of UPA 1. I think it really was, frankly, one of the most sort of golden periods in independent India's history. And it's certainly worth recreating.
We're at the end of our time, but I promised Colonel she could have the last word, so we'll give you a mic.
One last small...
We're trying to find your microphone.
I need a clarification.
We'll give you a microphone, then you can get your clarification.
Okay, thank you. The recent division of the Vokaligas and Lingayats in Karnataka, just before the elections are due by the Congress government, your government there. What would you have to say about that?
I think there are some questions which it is always wiser to answer in private. You know, my old boss in the UN, Kofi Annan always say there's no such thing as a foolish question. There are only foolish answers. So on this subject, let me, as the Americans say, take the fifth for now, and I'll have a word with you afterwards.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our. You've been talking, Shashi, for 1 hour and 20 minutes, which is much longer than we'd expected you to. Thank you for being so patient and being as brilliant as articulate as always.
Thank you, Vir, for your very important question.